itself was founded in 1328, in the 14th century, and has been active as a brewery ever since. One last comment here on the Augustinians. I don't know if you recognize this gentleman. He's a bit younger than we're used to seeing him. Also an Augustinian friar here in his habit with a book. The artist is Lukas Kranach. He's German, and his name is Martin Luther. Luther was an Augustinian friar. In 1505, as a young man in his early 20s, and there are different stories, I think some of them apocryphal, he, out of gratitude, I think, for sparing his life in a storm, at least so the story goes, vowed to join the brothers in the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt, which is where he was attending university. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. He was studying law. I think the true story is he wasn't so sure he wanted to be a lawyer. I don't know if the other choice was to be a friar, but that's what he chose. And Martin Luther is probably best known at that time, certainly, for then going on to teach at the university in Wittenberg. So he became really a famous scholar and professor. And then the 95 Theses, and by 1525, he married. We can assume he was no longer in the monastery. This is, in fact, Luther's Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. I just threw this in there. 2011, in fact, the Pope, a German, of course, as we know, traveled to Erfurt. I think it was a nice little ecumenical gesture, and in fact visited Martin Luther's monastery. So let me move on now to talk a little bit about monasteries. What are these places that monks and friars live? I'm sure you can't see that. I'll point out some things in just a minute. This is a very old plan, a map really, it's not an architectural sketch, but a map from around 800 of a Benedictine monastery. And this is still in St. Gall, Switzerland, in the library. And it really shows, I think you'll get a much better sense from this, what a monastery should look like. What do you need to have a monastery? So, just to orient you on this, and I've got one more slide, the Abbey Church. Of course you need a church to worship, to pray. All kinds of buildings here, a school, a guest house, gardens, a cemetery, a place for livestock, craftsman's house, barn, and then here we start to move into the interior of the monastery at its heart. Right next to the church is the cloister. The cloister is that part attached to the church, and the building surrounding it would be the dormitory, where the monks sleep. Then we have here a cellar and refectory, the dining hall where they eat. And over on the other side, cellars, the kitchen here, and so forth, the cloister. Cloister comes from the Latin word claustrum, related to the word claustrophobia, an enclosed space, an enclosure. And that's exactly what the cloister is, because in fact it delineates the interior part of the monastery from the exterior. Only the monks or friars are allowed into the cloister. It's closed off to public. You can go to the guest house, you can go to the gatehouse, you can go almost anywhere else, but you cannot, unless you're a monk, go into the cloister. It's reserved. It is that place for contemplation, for prayer, for an herb garden. There are lots of things that you can do with this space, but even most practically what it does is it connects the living quarters to the church. A cloister has a roof, and what it is, in fact, it functions as a covered walkway so the monks don't get wet when it's raining, but also a way for them to essentially travel between living quarters, eating areas, and the church without having to go into the exterior space. So we get a little bit of a better sense of it here, sort of as a model. Again, the church, this enclosure, a square, a rectangular shape, all of the other buildings around that, but again, that's the heart, the cloister. Now, I have to take just one little side note here, because what I like to tell my own students, or that they wouldn't know this otherwise, at Yale, at the university, which is very Gothic in its architecture, our own library is built on this monastic model. People don't know that, but there it is. This, in fact, and it looks very much like a church. It isn't. It is our temple of learning, I think. It's the library. We have this courtyard here, other buildings surrounding it, and what we have, in fact, is a lovely cloister right off of our main library, one of my favorite places, certainly, to sit and read a book. So we have this lovely little enclosed area that's private. You can go there. No one will bother you. That's our cloister. So now that we have a sense of who the Augustinians were, what they did, certainly in terms of preaching, they also worked as professors at universities, we have an idea of where they lived and the role that a cloister played in that. Let's go back to the geography for just a minute. This is, actually it's around 1500, an old view of Toulouse. So let's go back, visit Toulouse, our city. Here we have a view of the Pont Neuf, Saint Severin up in the background, one of the main churches. A medieval city like this would have anywhere between 100 and 200 churches, and easily dozens of monasteries. The Augustines certainly had a very important monastery here. We saw founded in the 1260s. I do just want to point this out. It was a very, very important center, Toulouse was, for the Dominicans. In fact, it was one of their very first monasteries. We could talk a lot about the heresy, the Albigensian heresy. But I think most important, and if you're ever here, what you definitely need to see, the cloister, of course. But also, this is the burial site, the grave site of Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas, probably the most important Dominican, is in fact buried here in Toulouse at the Mother House. It's a beautiful gilt coffin. Our own Augustinian monastery in Toulouse now, not Montreuil, in Toulouse, the main monastery. Of course, we can see here this garden is the cloister, another garden here. We get some sense of what this monastery looked like. This is what it looks like today. We're going to sort of just breeze through this. But what's interesting about it, it's actually still called the Musée des Augustins. It's still the Augustinian Museum, but not a museum of Augustinians, but rather a museum in the Augustinian monastery, which of course is no longer a monastery. Beautiful cloister here in the Augustinian monastery, in the museum. We see it here again, and some of this will start to echo, I think, when we look at our own cloisters. As you can imagine, those smaller monasteries that were built out from Toulouse took from Toulouse, from the main monastery, their inspiration. Here we have some older views of the cloister galleys, what it looks like today. It's really still quite beautiful and quite complete. I had to throw this in. This is 15th century from the museum, just because I think it's beautiful. A piece of late medieval sculpture. We recognize the theme. I thought one of the most interesting things for anybody who loves books, especially medieval books, Mary here is holding a book bag, or a bag book. It's a very interesting, curious thing. It's actually the binding is a bag, and the book is bound inside, so it protects it, and it's an easy way to carry it. Sort of an interesting feature of the 15th century. And of course, you know, I don't need to tell you more. I mean, just the pose and the look, it's quite unusual from what we're used to. He's distracted by something over here. She's distracted or just looking away. He's not behaving. Before, again, we get to our own monastery, a couple of other quick examples from the same region and some interesting parallels. Bonnefond, which is not too far from our own Montrejos, in the Pyrenees region, down in the south, is also, as you can see, a cloisters, kind of devoid of everything else. It's a cloisters that has been moved. So we see this is not at all unusual, actually, even in southern France. After the Revolution, 1790s, churches were for the most part closed or destroyed. The monks were sent packing. And what was left essentially was a monastery or a church that belonged to the community, and then they did whatever they wanted with it. They either took the stones and built other things, or they would take a cloister like this and move it into a park. So this particular cloister, as you can see, there are actually only 3 sides to it. The other side, I'll show you in a minute, was moved to another park not too far away. Here we get a really nice sense of what it looks like here. Also double columns, pointed arches,